you've probably got more and more ministers who are thinking, I wouldn't say even cynically, probably just quite sensibly, pragmatically, well, I'm not going to defend this because I can't see this lasting the week. I'd be surprised if it does. And I think this is a fundamental problem again that Rishi Sunak has, is that he's struggling to convince voters to believe in him, but he's also struggling to convince his own ministers to believe in him.
Let's start by getting up to speed on the political stories moving today. MPs are away from Westminster, but it hasn't stopped all the political headaches piling up for Number 10. Joining me this morning to take a good look at all of this is Isabel Hardman, Assistant Editor of The Spectator. Good morning to you, Isabel.
Good morning. Happy Easter.
And a happy Easter to you. Let's start with that story on the front page of the Times, which, as someone who wrote the book about the NHS, Fighting for Life, the 12 battles that made our NHS and the struggle for its future, this story on how the long waits in accident and emergency are killing 250 people every week.
Yeah, so this is from the Royal College of Emergency Medicine, and it says it's an estimation of 14,000 excess deaths last year, and that's people who are waiting more than 12 hours for a bed in A&E. And I think that will probably really chime with a lot of your listeners who've been to A&E or had loved ones who've been there, who, even those who are in a really, really bad way, have had to wait on a trolley or in some cases on the floor or on chairs. And even though the nurses and the medics are doing their absolute level best, it has seemed like an impossible situation. And I think this is one of the, politically, this is one of the really difficult things for Rishi Sunak, is that even if by the next election, which isn't that far away, things are starting to look a little bit easier in accident and emergency, which I'd be surprised by, I have to say, patients won't have forgotten what happened to them 12 months ago. They won't have forgotten that it took them much longer to see a doctor for worrying symptoms. They won't have forgotten that it took them much longer to have treatment, to have planned treatment. And the government has been able to pin some of this on industrial action, and that's been a huge factor. The NHS itself has been very clear that has really made things much harder. But these weights were going up before the pandemic, and so there is a question really of who gets the blame for this at the ballot box.
Yeah, and we had the story in the Times yesterday talking about how NHS trusts are being told to save up to £4.5 billion. I mean, this at a time when, as you say, they're struggling to get on top of those waiting lists, well over 7 million. We're hearing about the delays in A&E and the cost that's having, literally, and people losing their lives. The strikes, which have had a further impact on the efforts to try to tackle those waiting lists. And then they're being told they've got to try and save money as well.
Yeah, and that's a long running thing. I mean, that was a shocking story from Sean Linton in the Sunday Times yesterday. But it's a result of something that's been going on for a long time, which is a drive for higher productivity, greater efficiency in the NHS at a time when actually, as we've just seen, everything is very, very stretched. And so, to a certain extent, it's not a surprise you're seeing some trusts taking these decisions that are going to make things much harder, are going to make the standard of care much harder, and are actually going to leave those working in healthcare really struggling to manage what they're seeing and what they're dealing with. Medics and nurses obviously deal with a level of death and pain that the rest of us don't have to. But even they need to have a little bit more of a sort of rhythm to their day than they're getting at the moment, where they're not able to provide the standard of care consistently to patients that they're seeing. That can actually really lead to quite a lot of moral injury for those workers, and that can then lead to a worse standard of care for patients in the long term as well. So this is this is possibly not the worst point for the NHS.
Yeah, and I'm sure that's something that those out and about on the campaign trail over the bank holiday weekend will have voters talking to them about. And we've also got on the front page of the Times a new revolt looming, this time over a law to target the homeless, which appears to say that it could actually criminalise, or people could actually be penalised for sleeping rough.
Yeah, I mean, this is fascinating, isn't it? Because I think there's two things going on here. One is clearly legislation's been incredibly poorly drafted because it has managed to unite Tory MPs across the political spectrum. You've got the sort of One Nation group of Conservative MPs and the kind of traditional right of the party, who are both very upset about this because they think it's not the compassionate conservatism that they've tried to steer the party towards over the past few decades. They don't think that their party should be criminalising people for simply being homeless, or indeed, as this piece says, looking as though they might be about to sleep rough, which I think is, quite an odd thing to end up defining in law. The second thing, aside from the drafting, is that this really underlines that Tory MPs don't know what they're fighting for. So they don't know what Rishi Sunak stands for. And each week they're being asked really to support a piece of legislation that contradicts what was going on the previous week. And so you end up with MPs thinking, well, I'm just going to plough my own furrow because my leader's not giving me any direction, and MPs will be prepared to go over the top for unpopular things if they know why, and at the moment they don't know why.
Yeah, and we heard even the minister out and about, Kevin Hollinrake, this morning, struggling and clearly didn't want to defend the move. And they'd already had this absolute outcry, which forced a backtrack over the suggestion that homeless people might be banned from erecting tents in bad weather. I mean, you'd have thought that they would have learned the lesson from this. Instead, as you say, we have this legislation which would effectively mean that somebody could be considered a nuisance and could be moved on for having for sleeping in a doorway, having an excessive smell, or looking as though they might intend to sleep rough.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really significant that you've got ministers like Kevin Hollinrake, who is not a known troublemaker, but who are thinking, is it worth defending something that may not last 24 hours? And you've had a number of ministers humiliated recently, most notably over the Frank Hester comments, where I think you had 4 or 5 ministers who were sent out to defend this completely ridiculous line by the Conservative Party that his comments weren't racist, but they were unacceptable. And then Downing Street 24 hours later said that they were racist, which made fools of those ministers for towing a line they'd been told to stick to. So I think you've probably got more and more ministers who are thinking, I wouldn't say even cynically, probably just quite sensibly, pragmatically, well, I'm not going to defend this because I can't see this lasting the week. I'd be surprised if it does. And I think this is a fundamental problem again that Rishi Sunak has, is that he's struggling to convince voters to believe in him, but he's also struggling to convince his own ministers to believe in him.
Yeah, and so many MPs and ministers really aware of the problems they're facing. We had that poll in the Sunday Times yesterday suggesting that the Tories are heading for their worst election defeat, could end up with only with less than 100 seats. We've got a new poll today in the Mail suggesting it could be even worse. They could be down to just 80 MPs, with Labour on 470. I mean, when MPs see those sorts of polls day after day, week after week, it's hardly surprising, is it, that there's this renewed talk of a possible move against Rishi Sunak?
Yeah, and I think this really shows the impact also of reform, both in terms of polling. I mean, reform aren't expected to win seats, despite what this poll suggests, but what they are expected to do is to really pressure the Tory vote. And there are a lot of Conservative MPs who want the Conservative Party to sound more like reform. And then there are others who think that would be, in terms of the sort of wider coalition of voters, a huge mistake. But again, there's not one view on how to tackle the threat of reform, how the party should change the way it talks. And this is the real problem for Rishi Sunak and for particularly a lot of his MPs in the Red Wall.
And not just that, but it does seem to be, as you were saying just a moment ago, this series of blunders. Rishi Sunak's number 10 just doesn't seem to be able to get anything right. We seem to have one disaster after another. And there is increasing numbers of Tory MPs, aren't there, who perhaps a while ago were thinking, listen, we couldn't possibly even contemplate another leadership change, but are now thinking, well, maybe anything's better than what we've got. I mean, there's more talk across all of the papers today about a possible move, a possible challenge to Rishi Sunak's leadership. How likely do you think it is that they're going to take that risk?
I mean, I still don't think there are enough people who are prepared at this moment to go against him. But what I think has changed in the past few weeks from talking to MPs is that more of them don't think it's mad to replace their leader again. And I think that's the shift that we've had. That previously, the idea of having yet another prime minister without an election, most Conservative MPs think that would make their party look ridiculous. But I think more of them are starting to wonder whether Rishi Sunak himself is one of the major factors in their dire polling position, and whether another leader might stem the losses, because they're very much in stem the losses territory. And that was one of the things they thought Rishi Sunak was going to do after Liz Truss, that he would stem the losses, stop the party from, having an historic defeat at the next election, from which they might take a number of elections to recover. Now, if they're losing faith in him being able to do that, then you can see why they might start to think, oh, well, another leader wouldn't be ridiculous. But I don't think we're at the stage where you've got them actively, you've obviously got a few of them actively plotting, but most of them aren't actively thinking, right, now's the time to jump.
Isabel Hardman, assistant editor of The Spectator. Always great to have you with us. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Several of you getting in touch. We've had a long message from Clive talking about the NHS